Hello, I trust you are well. I am Peter Kirby, staff writer at Activist Post and author of the book Chemtrails Exposed, a New Manhattan Project. In this video, I will read from my article, The Vatican and the New Manhattan Project. The article makes a case for the notion that the Roman Catholic Church has been funding today's ongoing geoengineering operations. When I started this investigation, I didn't want to find out that big, dangerous entities like the Vatican, the CIA, and the Rockefeller family were behind it. I also didn't want to have to go on and on about debunking the theory of man-made global warming. But that's where the evidence is leading, and I will continue to follow the story. I trust that you will proceed without fear as well. Please join us. Today we see Pope Francis urgently and repeatedly warning us of the extreme dangers of climate change resulting from man's emissions of atmospheric carbon dioxide. This, while the author's greatly revised and expanded second edition of his book, Chemtrails Exposed, a New Manhattan Project, reveals that the theory of man-made climate change is a cover story and catalyst not only for a socio-economic agenda espoused by such politicians as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. It is also a cover story and catalyst for a global weather modification effort the author refers to as the New Manhattan Project. Ultimately, logic and facts prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that this over-popularized theory of man-made climate change is false. So why is Pope Francis insisting otherwise? Could it be that the Vatican is invested in this theory's agendas? In this article, we will examine the evidence suggesting that the Vatican is invested in today's New Manhattan Project. In mid-2011, under Pope Benedict XVI, the Vatican first publicly got involved in the climate issue by endorsing a study commissioned by the Vatican's Pontifical Academy of Sciences. The study is called Fate of Mountain Glaciers in the Anthropocene, and it advocates for a strong policy response to the threat of man-made climate change. In the report, geoengineering is discussed. In the panel discussions leading up to the report, solar radiation management geoengineering, chemtrails, was discussed. In June 2015, Pope Francis produced an encyclical titled Laudato Si, which outlined his position on man-made climate change. In late 2017, a geoengineering seminar was held for Pope Francis's new dicastery for promoting integral human development. The seminar was organized by the Carnegie Climate Geoengineering Governance Initiative and included presentations by representatives from the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies, Climate Interactive, and the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center. Carnegie-funded organizations have an extensive history of promoting solar radiation management geoengineering. As explained in the author's book, SRM geoengineering is code for the modern state of the biggest scientific effort in history. The author refers to this effort as the New Manhattan Project. Interestingly, when one looks back in history for more Vatican connections to the New Manhattan Project, one finds plenty. Evidence presented in the author's book reveals extensive connections between the World War II Nazi regime and the New Manhattan Project. Not surprisingly, the record also shows that the Vatican was aligned with the Nazis and provided support to them before, during, and after their reign. At the turn of the century, the Church's laws began to be redrafted in such a way as to allow for power to be centralized in the Vatican. These laws were published and brought into force in 1917. Upon the death of Pope Benedict XV in early 1922, the Church was not in a good financial condition. In order to meet expenses, the Vatican was forced to secure loans, mostly from German banks. This may have been the later Nazi regime's initial foothold. In early 1929, the Vatican seized a new, elevated position in world power. In that year, the Lateran Treaty between Italy and the Church further centralized power in the Vatican. Not only that, the Lateran Treaty established Vatican City as a sovereign nation, as it granted vast amounts of other extraterritorial holdings of land elsewhere in Rome and Italy. As a result of this treaty, Catholicism was declared the official religion of Italy and was to be taught in all public and private schools. The treaty stipulated further that Italy give the Vatican and the Pope $90 million in cash and bonds, as well as another undisclosed sum. The Italian government also agreed to pay the salaries of all the parish priests in the country. In return for all this, the Church relinquished claims to lands previously seized by the Italian government and agreed to establish diplomatic relations with same. The Lateran Treaty codified the power of the Vatican and reinvigorated the Roman Catholic Church, allowing it to become the vast entity of centralized power that it is today. All this about centralization of authority within the Vatican and a concurrent infusion of power and wealth is relevant to our discussion because these are events that allowed for the later rise of Nazi Germany and the systematic extermination of millions of people. You see, in the 1870s, the German government had passed a series of laws which persecuted Catholics, but because their grassroots was empowered, the German Catholic clergy of the 1870s and their laity successfully resisted this persecution. It was a messy process. Lots of property and lives were ruined in the struggle, but ultimately the people prevailed. Hitler and his fellow National Socialists, as well as many leaders in the Vatican, knew before the Nazis' rise to power that German Catholics would strongly resist the rise of a violently anti-Semitic regime such as theirs. German Catholic resistance had the potential to derail the Nazi effort. In order for Hitler to rise to power and execute the Holocaust, those involved knew that the German Catholics needed to be pacified and put on the sidelines. Hitler had written about it in Mein Kampf. Once an adequate level of power was centralized in the Vatican, enabling the Church to successfully enforce a German Catholic stand-down, the Nazis would then be able to move forward with their plans. That's not to say that German Catholics completely stood down during World War II. They didn't. But these necessary levels of centralized power were ultimately achieved, and new technologies in the areas of travel and communications also arrived to help the Nazis effectively squelch domestic Catholic dissent. Working from the beginning to achieve all of this was the former Eugenio Pacelli, Pope Pius XII, also known as Hitler's Pope. Pacelli, as a young lawyer, worked on the aforementioned turn-of-the-century redrafting of church law, which centralized power in the Vatican. He also worked as papal nuncio in Munich and Berlin during the 1920s, enforcing the laws he had helped redraft. As he enforced these redrafted laws, Pacelli was also pursuing a Reich Concordant, a treaty between Germany and Rome that would finally create the situation needed for Hitler's swift rise to power. In late 1929, Pacelli was summoned to Rome. In light of his successful contributions to the Vatican's recent resurgence, he was made a cardinal and the new Vatican Secretary of State, the second most powerful position in all of the Catholic Church. He immediately set to work on the Reich Concordant. Through a series of deft political maneuverings carried out by Pacelli, on July 20th, 1933, the Reich Concordant was signed by Pacelli on behalf of the Vatican and by Franz von Papen on behalf of Germany. Along the way, as results of the negotiations, Adolf Hitler was made Chancellor of Germany, and the German Parliament passed legislation which greatly increased Hitler's powers. The Reich Concordant constituted a full prostration of the German Catholic Church in open cooperation with the Nazis. About 2 months after the signing of the Concordant, the German Catholic bishops, who had previously issued a statement condemning the Nazis, now issued a statement of submission before the Third Reich. In fact, as part of the agreement, Catholic bishops throughout Germany were obliged to take a loyalty oath to the Third Reich. Criticism of the new authoritarian doctrines passed down from the Vatican was prohibited. To top it all off, the Reich Concordant stipulated that a 9% tax on salaried income was to be levied upon all practicing Catholics in Germany. This tax was taken directly out of people's paychecks and produced billions in revenue for the Church. It wasn't long after the signing of the Concordant that Hitler, through an order issued by Pacelli, mandated that the German political party, which had represented the German Catholics, the Center Party, dissolve itself. The chairman of the deposed Catholic Center Party then urged German Catholics to sacrifice their freedoms for a strong and secure state, while Pacelli instructed them to be loyal Catholics through their loyalty to the Nazis. Hitler noted that the terms of the Concordant were of great help, quote, in the urgent fight against international Jews, unquote. Synchronously, Pacelli turned a blind eye to not only the ongoing persecution of the Jews, but also the executions of leading German Catholic leaders, and continued to do so throughout the war. Pacelli, the Vatican, and the Nazis had successfully executed an end run around the German Catholic laity. When Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli was coronated as Pope Pius XII on March 12, 1939, he presided over the most powerful Roman Catholic Church in history. On September 1st of that same year, the Nazis invaded Poland and were well on their way. After the war, the Vatican made millions from selling false passport papers to fleeing Nazi war criminals and other activities associated with the formation of a rat line to South America. As Paul Williams, the author of The Vatican Exposed, writes, quote, fleeing war criminals were sheltered within Vatican City and granted new identities, unquote. For this protection, the fleeing Nazis usually had to pay 40 to 50% of their complete savings. Williams continues, quote, several prominent Nazi criminals, including Franz Stangl, commandant of Treblinka, were granted living quarters within the confines of Vatican City and at the Pope's summer residence at Castel Gandolfo. Others were lodged with Catholic families who were pleased to open their doors to Vatican guests for a small stipend. Still other criminals were sheltered in monasteries under the guise of friars, monks, and religious brothers. By 1946, these facilities were filled to capacity, and scores of fugitive Nazis were housed in convents where they were dressed in full habit as nuns, unquote. Williams specifies, quote, in addition to Klaus Barbie and Franz Stangl, the church sheltered such luminaries as Adolf Eichmann, Hitler's top henchman and director of the genocide program, Edward Rauschmann, the butcher of Roga, SS General Walter Rauff, inventor of the mobile gas truck, Gustav Wagner, commandant of the Sobibor camp, and Dr. Joseph Mengele, the angel of death at Auschwitz, unquote. The Vatican has potential financial connections to the New Manhattan Project. The Vatican's main financial institution, the Institute for Works of Religion, also known as the Vatican Bank, was founded by none other than our friend Pope Pius XII, and has been investing in companies associated with the New Manhattan Project. The Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, has a history of working with the Vatican Bank, and, as readers of this work already know, the CIA is most probably the overall day-to-day manager of today's New Manhattan Project. In 1942, the Vatican Bank was founded by Hitler's Pope and another man by the name of Bernardino Nogara. As explained earlier, Pius XII had made sure that robust revenue streams were coming in like never before. So they needed to do something with all the cash, hence the Vatican Bank. The foundation of the bank had a lot to do with being able to transfer money to Swiss bank accounts for the funding of religious works, you understand. They apparently considered Operation Gladio a religious work, but we'll get into that in a moment. The Vatican Bank is owned and controlled entirely by the reigning pope, the self-described vicarious representative of Jesus Christ on earth, a man we are supposed to believe in. One of the Vatican Bank's 3 boards of directors consists of prominent international bankers. Now, Operation Gladio was a North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and CIA collaboration that involved staging terrorist attacks throughout Europe, mostly in Italy, to be blamed on communist factions while, in actuality, the attacks were perpetrated by fascist or capitalist ones. This was done in order to galvanize public opinion for capitalism and against communism. As a direct result of Operation Gladio, 491 people were killed and 1,181 injured or maimed. Operation Gladio was funded by profits from a global heroin racket that involved the CIA, American and Sicilian mafias, and a multinational pharmaceutical corporation called Schiaparelli. The profits from this enterprise were laundered through the Vatican Bank and distributed to the perpetrators of Operation Gladio through Swiss banks. We can now see how the Vatican and the CIA have participated in dastardly deeds to grow their power while creating the perception of virtue. It's kind of like how geoengineers propose spraying the Earth and all of its biota with tens of thousands of megatons of toxic materials in order to save us from global warming. Maybe drug money laundered through the Vatican Bank is funding today's New Manhattan Project. By 1968, the Vatican was a major shareholder in General Electric, IBM, and other large American corporations. The Vatican has also been invested in Chase Manhattan Bank and Standard Oil. These corporations have documented connections to the New Manhattan Project. Pope Benedict XVI, Pope Francis, and the Vatican have demonstrated that they believe that the fight against global warming is worthy of their involvement. To what extent they are involved remains unclear, but when taking into consideration the evidence presented here, it is not unreasonable to think that the Vatican is involved in funding the New Manhattan Project. The master thesis of the Catholic Church is that man is bad and must be made better by the Church. This is analogous to how today's geoengineers say that we are in trouble because of man's activities and need to be made better by geoengineering. Let us not forget that, over the centuries, the Catholic Church has ordered many persecutions and executions over differences of scientific opinion. These differences of opinion pertained to matters where the Church was 180 degrees wrong. Does that sound familiar? Just like the theory of man-made global warming is more about money, politics, and power than science, the Vatican is less of a religious organization and more of a political organization. They always have been. They are even less of a scientific organization. They are not a legitimate scientific authority and, at least in this case, should not be operating as one. Today, the Vatican is at least providing rhetorical support for the spraying of tens of thousands of megatons of toxic waste from aircraft annually. What are they doing at most? For all the details of today's New Manhattan Project, please refer to the new, greatly revised and expanded second edition of the author's book, Chemtrails Exposed, A New Manhattan Project, available exclusively at Amazon.com. Also, please join my email list at my website, peterakirby.com. Thank you.